recording. I've got sorry, there's multiple steps in this whole process here. And Manuel, when I'm done, I'll switch our roles. So welcome. There aren't a lot of you. So this is going to be sort of new hat for none of you, old hat for pretty much all of you. I'm not going to go over, since I think quite literally everybody here is already familiar with the group and the goal and whatever else. Let me just flag one thing, which is I've said all along that one of the goals was to highlight work by junior researchers, and as several of you already know, and indeed some of them are already here in the group, I've been sort of working to put together a group of scholars, all sort of early career researchers. They're stretched out around the world, and they've got a blog that they've been working on, and they've been sort of meeting on Zoom. Sort of all that stuff is behind the scenes, but the goal wasn't just to sort of provide them, connect them to one another. I mean, the ultimate goal was to connect the stuff that they're doing to everybody else, and so that's something that is now the first sort of instantiation of that is going to happen next month. And so in terms of upcoming events, now we've just figured this out in the last 2 days, so we don't yet have the titles and the abstracts, but I'll share that soon enough. So in terms of the fall semester, so tonight we have Manuel, and then on October 20th at 7, 2 of the members of this early career research group will be giving talks. Kristen Mickelson will give a talk in the first half. So the idea for this is to have basically a 30-minute talk followed by 30 minutes of Q&A, and then another 30-minute talk followed by another 30-minute of Q&A. And the idea is this gives them a sort of pipeline for the stuff they're working on in the group, and it gives them opportunity to share this stuff with a broader audience. So that's the goal. Michael McKenna is giving his talk, and if we're just focused on this semester in late November. And then there's a book symposium. The book symposium I should, just to be clear, I had absolutely nothing to do with. And Andre Bukharev asked if I thought this would be a suitable place to have such a thing, which of course I thought, yes, this is a perfectly suitable place. So he's organized this entire thing. So there's the book is Freedom and Responsibility in Context, which is by Ann Whittle, and there'll be commentary by Barbara Vetter and Richard Fellman, and that's on December 1st at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. This is that time as a time they selected. And then in the spring, I don't think we have any dates for this and times except for Hannah's talk, but we'll have also another great, I'm very honored to have another great lineup. So Kadri Favellin will give a talk in January, and then Hannah's talks in March. Helen's talks will be in April. And then we haven't figured out the date for Pamela's talk. Now, finally, I said, I've suggested we're going to do this a couple of times. So Al and Eddie and Adina and John have all agreed to do this. I've just failed to do a very good job of finding a date that works for everybody. So it is, having seen it now again in preparing this, I'll do a better job of finding a suitable time for them to do it, because it's something it's a very timely topic and something I think lots of people will be interested in attending. So I'll figure that out soon. So you guys know the routine. I said I would mute, you wouldn't be able to mute yourselves, but you can. This was here again for the Zoom bombing stuff. And I don't even think we have to worry about some of this other stuff, because it's all a bunch of people who already know how this works. So you all know Manuel, but I'm gonna give you the introduction anyway, because it's important to do these sorts of things for people who may not be as familiar with his research. So Manuel Vargas is a professor of philosophy at the University of California, San Diego. His research focuses on the overlap of moral, psychological, and legal issues concerning human agency and freedom. He also writes about contemporary Latinx philosophy and the history of Mexican philosophy, which I'm stoked that he's going to connect all those things I just said. I'm like very excited to see how all this works. I think it's amazing that he's doing that sort of work these days. He's the author of Building Better Beings, A Theory of Moral Responsibility, which is one of the very best book titles in agency and responsibility of all time. I love the title of that book. It won the American Philosophical Association's Book Prize in 2015. Along with John Martin Fisher, Robert Kane, and Dirk Perabroom, he co-authored 4 Views on Free Will. And with John Doris, he recently edited the Oxford Handbook of Moral Psychology. And finally, with Gideon Yaffe, he edited Rational and Social Agency, the philosophy of Michael Bratman. From 2019 to 21, he and Santiago Amaya co-directed a $1.2 million project funded by the John Templeton Foundation to foster philosophical work on free will, agency, and responsibility in Latin America. And if you don't know some of the stuff that he and Santiago have done on that front, you should look into it, because he's done amazing work, I think, there too. It's very important development for the field of the free will research. He's held year-long research fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard, and the Stanford Humanities Center. Finally, he's been a visiting fellow at the McCoy Center for Ethics and Society at Stanford University, and has held visiting appointments at the University of California, Berkeley, the California Institute of Technology, and Stanford University. So with all of that said, please join me in welcoming Manuel Vargas as our speaker this evening. Manuel, give me just 1 second to unshare so that you can share, and let me replace myself as the person who is now pinned and make the person who is now pinned you. 1 second. And that should be all you need from me. You should be able to share, and everything else should be ready to go. So thanks again for being willing to do this.
Okay, thanks for having me. So am I audible? Let me check for sound. Okay, people can hear
yes, me. Yes, you're on my end, you're just fine.
Okay, and let's see, is this showing up okay?
Yep.
All right. Okay, so the date there is wrong, because that was the last time I tried to give this talk, and I haven't changed the date on this slide, which tells you that half my brain is in the past, and the other half is on trying to do some recent changes to this talk. So we'll see how this goes. Hopefully this won't be a total disaster. But I want to say, first of all, thanks to Thomas for having me and inviting me. And it's wonderful to see so many friends here, and look forward to the day when we can all be in the same room again. It feels like maybe we're getting closer there, but it's been a long time since I got to go to a conference surrounded by lots of folks who are thinking about and working on free will and getting to hang out in person with folks. So it's terrific to see you all here, and thanks so much for coming. Okay, so this talk is a sort of is maybe an ill-advised attempt to bring together my 2 great loves in philosophy. So that is work on kind of questions about moral agency, free will, and moral responsibility in particular, and issues in the history of philosophy in Mexico. And so what I'm going to try to do here is a combination of some amount of reflections on what I think is going to be, way too fast and dirty contemporary philosophy of action, or at any rate, not too distant philosophy of action. And then I'm going to spend some time talking about some ideas from the history of Mexican existentialism. And then I'm going to try to find a way to pull them together. And the particular idea that's going to figure in from my extractive work from the history of Mexican existentialism is the idea that agency can have an echo, and what the relationship is of that echo to institutions enabling agency. So that's the plan here. We'll see how this works. There are going to be parts of this talk where I'm just going to talk through some slides, and then there'll be some parts where I'll read, so in hopes that I don't completely screw up the attributions of views to philosophers who I'm going to be complaining about. Okay, so that's the ambition. So let's go ahead and get started. So I want to talk about a phenomenon that I think of as encultured agency. And one of the things that I'm going to do is I want to start with a kind of case that brings out what I think of as both the fact that a lot of how our agency unfolds is always culturally embedded, culturally located, and how those things alter what kinds of things people can do. And if you thought that what philosophy of action is about and what agency is about the doings, putting it really crudely, then to the extent to which the cultural world configures what we can do, it looks like we can say something like the cultural world configures our agency in a certain kind of way. Now, of course, these are all very broad, general kinds of claims that I'm going to have to try to make good on in more and less ways. But I want to start with a case that I think brings this out, because I think one of the things that there's a kind of tradition of thought experiments that appeal to relatively thin and abstract cases that I think can be really important for trying to identify some general principles. But one consequence of those kinds of cases is that sometimes it can they're sufficiently denuded that we are unable to see the kind of messiness of lots of real world cases of agency. And it's some of that messiness of real world cases of agency that is going to be a big part of my focus here. So I'm going to start with a case here that comes from the Mexican philosopher or Uruguayan Mexican philosopher, Jorge Pereda. So he's at the National Autonomous University of Mexico in Mexico City, and he's got this fantastic case that goes like this. One Saturday afternoon, Magdalena and Jorge are on their way home to get back to their children, and they're passing through an unfamiliar town during rush hour. They're stopped by a police officer who tells Jorge that Magdalena, the driver, has violated some local traffic laws, encroaching on a bike lane without signaling. Jorge acknowledges this, but notes that virtually everyone else is doing the same thing, and there really are no cyclists visible. Impatient, the police officer replies by asserting that Magdalena has committed a further, fully fictional infraction, one that requires the impounding of the vehicle until a fine is paid at the city office. Worse, that office isn't going to be open again until Monday, that is 2 days from now. Jorge then asks to speak to the officer, man to man. The officer nods, and Jorge asks him for some recommendations about where to get a meal locally with Magdalena. The officer smiles. The officer understands what's going on here, and he says, and he gives him a recommendation. And then Jorge then offers the officer some money to thank him for his good advice. The police officer accepts and sends the couple on their way without issuing an infraction. Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is a kind of case that if you live in certain parts of the world, it's going to be super familiar sort of case, and it's a case under which you've got the fact of rampant police corruption, the expectation of bribery as an ordinary course of action. And so there's a kind of pressure in these sorts of cases to either comply or have to engage in some very convoluted activity for resisting. Now, it's not impossible because, of course, you could insist that the officer take you down to the station and that you have the whole thing in front of other officers there, or you know, maybe get the media involved and so on.
Hey, Manuel.
But, yeah.
Sorry, I don't think your slides are advancing.
Okay, so
my
slides.
It looks like you have a slide that has like maybe under a bridge or something, but that's not displaying. The only slide that's displaying for us is the original Echoes of Agency.
Okay, so this is going to be a funny talk then if none of the slides are working here. So on my end, the slide is showing, but let's see, I can stop share. Okay, so let's try this again.
Yeah, no worries.
All right, well, we may end up doing this without slides. We'll see here. Okay.
We're not in a hurry, man. You're fine. There we go. That looks so that is advanced to the
okay, and if I do that, is that full screen?
No, but it has advanced to the slide I think you're on.
Okay, does that advance the slide?
Try it again.
Okay, so apparently not. Okay, so let me try one other thing here. Okay.
I mean, we're not in a rush. We can figure it out.
Well,
you're among friends, Manuel.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see. Sorry here. Right. Okay, so let's see. Samantha's got what should be helpful advice, but Zoom doesn't like my sharing of this window. Okay, well, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to just do this without slides. I'm going to just talk you through this because I don't want to have to sit here fighting with the slides.
Manuel, did you want to do? I think this happened when we were teaching. Did you want to try to do what we did last time?
So if you remember what we did last time, I'm happy to try it.
Yeah, I think up top you're supposed to do view or like slideshow and then play and window.
Okay.
That's it.
Oh yeah, it was working.
So view, and then I go to.
It was.
Yeah, I'm not seeing the relevant thing here.
Hit share again because it looked like it was working.
Okay. I've now finally become the age at which tech problems are inevitable. Okay.
I think you're supposed to hit full screen before you start sharing, or hit
Okay.
play before you start sharing.
Okay.
So unshare.
All right. So play and then, okay. So I see what you're saying. Okay. So let's try this again. God, this is
No, man, you're fine. There's no hurry. I mean, we're all here to listen to talk. I'd rather see the slides if I can, so I'm not in a rush.
the slides are not that great. Okay, so all right, let's see. So hit play and then go to share. Is that right? Okay, how about that?
Yes.
And then if I do this, does something happen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, all right. Okay, so some thoughts about the Jorge, the Magdalena and Jorge case here. So one of the things, notice that if, I mean, there's a bunch of different questions we could ask. So some are going to be forward-looking questions about like, how should we go forward into the cases of these suboptimal real world kinds of conditions where there's an unwillingness to take seriously the rule of law and things like that. But they're the backward-looking questions that I want to focus on. And so that, about who's at fault and for what. And I think here, assessing culpability is just a mess. It's a mess because you can imagine, for example, Magdalena complaining about why did Jorge adopt a totally sexist posture in trying to resolve this? Could he have done this without, you know, the whole routine about speaking man to man? And you know, does it matter that they had dependents at home that they were urgently trying to get back to? Would it matter if, for example, Jorge and or Magdalena had a long history of complaining about the hypocrisy of paying bribes to corrupt police officers? All of these things seem to matter for our assessments about to the extent to which these folks are culpable or not for bribing the police officer. And we can ask similar questions about the police officers for the police officer for demanding the bribe. But part of the thought here is that it's just not even straightforward. I mean, one thing you could even think is that it's not even clear there was wrongdoing in the case. Then, you know, related sorts of questions here: were they free? Was Jorge acting autonomously? Why or why not? What kinds of deliberatively available alternatives did they have? What can we reasonably demand of them? I think these, in a case like this, which again, I think it's pretty much a very, very ordinary real world case in lots of the world, these questions don't have, I think, super obvious answers to them. And you might think, ideally, it would be awesome if philosophy could guide us on some of these kinds of questions. Okay, so that's it by way of setup of the Magdalena and Jorge case. We're going to talk more about this in a moment. But I want to talk for a little bit here about some general questions in the philosophy of agency. Okay, so one of the things that actually, you know, these slides are going to drive me up the wall here because we're going to get rid of the slides. Sorry about that. I know people wanted the slides, but this is just going to be too distracting for me to try to continue to run the slides here. Okay, so here's the thought. So one of the things that that I'm interested in, and one of the claims I want to argue for, is that the best characterization of some of these sophisticated forms of agency, and here by that I mean these enculturated forms of agency where you have some sense about how to navigate a very specific and culturally loaded world, doesn't turn out to be isolated from our other interests, and that they depend on what I'm going to call the social context of agency. So how and why we care about things like self-control or free will and so on, what we think these things are, I think, is bound up in what roles these notions play in our shared cooperative lives. So that's right now, this is at the stage of raw assertion about what I think I want to try to get us to. Now, the ability to do certain kinds of things, to be a good spouse, to be a bad Catholic, a mediocre presenter of ideas, or an elegant dancer, those things depend on our being in culture that is familiar with how to navigate sets of norms in a particular kind of environment. And so I think a philosophy of action, has so far said a great deal about, as it were, kind of internal psychological states of agents, but much less about the relationship of those agents to these complicated socially structured worlds, for which the gesture I'm making here is to an idea of encultured agents. So to adopt a picture where the thought is part of what a philosophy of action has to do is to say something about these kinds of questions is, of course, to go in a very different direction than a good deal of 20th century philosophy of action did. So, if you think about it kind of roughly from 1960 to the end of the 20th century, if you wanted to understand agency, the kinds of accounts that we worked with were accounts that focused on things like intentional action or free will, maybe sometimes responsibility and autonomy, and that tried to account for those things in terms of broadly psychological elements like beliefs and desires and intentions. And the mainstream of the field proceeded on broadly what I would characterize or think of as a kind of individualistic or atomistic vein, identifying attitudes or which individual agential capacities in the arrangement of them was required for comparatively foundational notions like intentional action, right on up to full-blown accounts of things like free will and responsible agency. So that was the way the story got told. But I think one of the interesting challenges that emerges for that kind of research program is that it's precisely, we lack the ability to say much about these encultured agent cases without some supplementary element. And then the question is, okay, so what has to get added to those older accounts? And I want to emphasize that I think this is, it can be and probably should be additive, in the sense that not that we do away with these old models of the belief, desire, intention kinds of models. I think we need those models. They're going to be part of a full story, but rather they have to be supplemented or added to with a story about the relationship of those things to an encultured environment. Okay, so one reason for thinking, and so here I want to spend at least a couple of minutes motivating why we've got to go in that direction. So I gave you a case, the Magdalena and Jorge case, which I think suggests some reasons for it. But you might think, well, maybe we can kind of account for some of the complexities of that kind of case by using the resources of a story that is, as it were, kind of fully atomistic or fully intentionally in the head. And I'm skeptical that we can do it. And I'm going to just point to one kind of story that I think is not a promising way of trying to do it, but that's going to be familiar to everybody here in the room. So one way you might think about this kind of case is to think about an approach that is in that old 20th century style model, is to think about these things in a kind of broadly Frankfurtian way. So as everybody here knows, Frankfurt's got this basic idea where it's hierarchies of desires that we can use to explain a wide range of features about agency, including whether or not somebody has acted freely and about whether or not they're responsible for their action. We can fill in all the details in various ways. There are kind of two serious challenges for this as a model for thinking about responsibility in particular. So one is the familiar indoctrination challenge. So we got this from Wolf and the JoJo case, right, where the idea is, well, look, you can just implant or indoctrinate or brainwash somebody, and you might have the right psychological mesh, but you're not going to end up intuitively, you don't have an agent that is a free and responsible agent. And of course, there are different ways you can put pressure on that. You might think, well, maybe they're free, but they're not responsible. There are a variety of things we can say about those kinds of cases, but I think a lot of folks have found, not everybody, of course, it's philosophy, but a lot of people have found these kinds of cases to be serious challenges for at least a story that is told with entirely internal psychological features doing the work. But there's a second kind of case that has gotten less attention, but I think for our purposes and thinking about the Jorge Magdalena case, or the Magdalena Jorge case, is maybe a more interesting case, and that's to think about coercion. So Frankfurt claims that that in a coercion case, well, okay, so first standard coercion case, just take the the mugger who threatens somebody with, give me your bank account login information or your life. In that case, despite being a paradigmatic case of when coercion limits or removes responsibility for giving the money over, you might think, look, it's just on the face of it, it's not clear how an identification story is going to end up handling this kind of case. And so Frankfurt claims that a coerced agent acts from a motive by which he would prefer not to be moved. And this explains why the agent doesn't act freely or responsibly or autonomously. But you might wonder, like, why is that the right description of what's going on? Why isn't this a case where all things considered, the agent does prefer to be moved by the motive to comply with the demand? Most people have a strongly endorsed desire to act in ways that avoid risk of immediate death. In the present case, the alternative to not being moved by the motive seems like the stuff of nightmares. So I think, like, imagine the terror of being on the receiving end of this kind of coercive threat, feeling the desire to comply under the threat in virtue of the value you put on your life, and then discovering that you're not, in fact, moved by that first order desire to comply, nor by the higher order attitude that one be so moved to act by the first order impulse to survive. Right? This just would be terrifying if this was the situation in which you found yourself. Now, I think what Frankfurt goes on to say sharpens the worry that this broadly internalist story looks like it's ill-suited to capture the relatively pedestrian thought that coercion is an impairment to freedom and responsibility, at least in some cases when it gets sufficiently robust. And he considers a pair of cases where somebody comes up to a fork in a road, and then on the left fork, the left fork, there's a risk of an avalanche, and on the right fork, it's wide open. And then he says, okay, so, and you know that there's a serious risk of an avalanche on the left side. Then he compares that to a case under which same kind of fork decision, and the except that now there's an intervener who's going to trigger the avalanche. So it's no longer just a natural avalanche, it's an intervener caused avalanche. And what he says about this difference, so I think the natural thing to think is, okay, well, where there's an intervener, there's coercion, and where there's coercion, this impairs your freedom in a different way than if the world was just arranged in the avalanche way. Now, part of, I think, what's fascinating about this case is well, what's fascinating about it is what Frankfurt says about it. So what Frankfurt says is there are interesting differences between these situations, to be sure, but there is no basis for regarding the man as acting more or less freely or of his own free will in the one case than in the other. Whether he is morally responsible for his decision or action in each case depends on the way in which his desires to avoid it operates within him. Now, I think, well, it's of course in keeping with Frankfurt's general strategy that one look to the structure of the agent's desires to decide whether there's an impairment in freedom. But I think the resulting picture is a little odd. First, I think, of course, it's plausible that one might think they're cases where they're in fact importantly different from one another. In the scenario with an intervener, the intervener's actions impoverish the opportunities available to the driver. So for those of you who are my friends who are incompatibilists here, you're going to think that fact alone might bear on responsibility if you thought that alternative possibilities was really important here. But putting that aside, there's still a second worry. I think it's unclear how you can tell a satisfactory story about the difference in coercion cases and everyday decision cases where we don't choose our decision sets if all you've got are things inside the head of the agent. So there's a tension, I think, in Frankfurt's account concerning a trio of thoughts. So there's one is his allowance that non-responsibility and coercion cases are to be explained by differences in the desiderative structure of the agent. But then he also thinks that the intervener, no intervener avalanche cases are identical. And then he also thinks that they're the same with respect to freedom and responsibility, and that there's no diminution of responsibility. And I think the intervener case, to me anyway, looks like a case of coercion in as much as it alters the possibilities available to the agent in a way the agent doesn't want. But then it's hard to explain why that difference doesn't occur in the natural avalanche case as well. Something seems to have gone missing. We need to say more about what's going on in these cases. So I think it's very, so this is, and here I don't want to hinge too much on Frankfurt interpretation. We can, you know, you don't have to be committed to Frankfurt, but it's an illustration, I think, of some of the troubles of trying to figure out what's going on in important classes of cases that I think intuitively seem to impinge upon freedom and responsibility. But if all you've got are things inside the head, as it were, to explain these things away, it looks like you're going to have a tough time accounting for these cases. Of course, a staunch defender of Frankfurt's going to have things that he or she is going to want to say. But I think that on the general approach, there's clearly a lot of work that has to be done here. And I think contra Frankfurt, we do seem to care about how people's desires relate to normative features of the agent's environment. Okay, so some initial thoughts about Frankfurt out of the way, then I want to go back to the Magdalena and Jorge case. So I think one thing that case, that Jorge and Magdalena case brings out is that we have some interest in the quality of a person's options. So for things to have unfolded for Magdalena and Jorge the way it did requires a certain amount of, for example, anonymous and regularized police corruption. So you can imagine lots of things could have gone differently if, for example, people regularly filmed police interactions, or there were heavy duty penalties or consequences for police who got reported for taking bribes. If the society were less patriarchal, for example, it would be very difficult for Jorge to try to resolve it by appealing to the, hey, let's have a conversation man to man about this kind of case. There might be a lot of different kinds of things about how one would act in this sort of case that really depends on the matrix of social or cultural features that are going on in that sort of case. And so I think this points to an appealing explanation of why coercion and indoctrination seem to undermine responsibility when they do. What they do is it looks like it points to what a change in what we can reasonably demand of agents in those circumstances. So, for example, in the password or your life coercion case, the cost of not surrendering the demanded information is plausibly too high for us to expect that an agent's going to resist the coercion. In contrast, threatening the victim with a display of bad table manners isn't going to be a reasonable, or it seems like a totally reasonable cost to bear to protect your financial information, right? So you might think, okay, but then we can start to tinker with what's in that spectrum, right? So the being exposed to bad table manners, that's not super costly, but how about, and then, we start to ramp up what those costs are. Shame and embarrassment, is that enough? Well, maybe in a shame culture, it's actually a super high cost. In a culture that's not particularly concerned about shame, except for, 20 minutes on social media or whatever, then you might think that's not an unreasonable cost. And it looks like those questions are going to be outside, as it were, outside of the head of the particular agent in a certain, in at least one important kind of way. So the exculpatory force in those coercion cases, when it's present, seems to flow from the fact that the coerced agent's options don't meet some fair or reasonable standard for us to rightly enjoin her to act in a particular kind of way. So if that's right, then one important question to ask at the Magdalena and Jorge case is what it's reasonable for us to expect of them, given the social world they find themselves in. And I think, of course, we should expect that there's going to be some disagreement about how to answer that kind of question. So rather than focusing on whether a given agent acted in a way that produced a certain form of psychological coherence, that's the kind of broadly Frankfurtian strategy, these reflections suggest we do better to look at agents in a context where the salient features of that are going to oftentimes matter. Now, one way to put this thought is that in the social world, to a very large degree, it configures our actional possibilities and thus our agency. Now, thinking this, of course, we don't have to deny that the material or physical arrangements of the world matter. We can't wish away a drought or a hurricane, as much as we would have liked to have wished away some of that in Southern California recently. And we can't, that the substrate of the arrangement of the physical and material world matters a great deal, but our landscape is shaped by these deliberative options. Our deliberative options are shaped by the social configuration. So whether or not we've got social rules about being a mother, a tile layer, a neighbor, a Muslim, and so on, these things affect what it is you can do and what the consequences are for not doing them. The existing shape of institutions, legal regimes, religious practices, formal economic arrangements, basically any organized social practices with roles, and the stability and reliability of the social meanings, that is how people interpret what it is that you've just done within that space. All these things interact in ways to transform or shape what it is that you can do. Okay, so a bunch of different ideas now on the table. I'm going to try to regiment them in the following way. Let ecological theories of moral responsibility refer to theories according to which important forms of morally notable agency depend in part on relational properties or things otherwise extrinsic to the psychology and physical bodies of an agent. So that's the idea of ecological agency. There are different ways to do the metaphysical bookkeeping of this account. So there's the way I like to do it. There's the way that my colleagues, Dana and David, like to do it. Their way is probably better because there's two of them and only one of me. But I think but at the end of the day, I think they're largely notational differences here rather than substantive metaphysical differences here. So on one account, for example, you could think that responsibility is grounded in normative competence plus situational control. That's the way they do it. Or you can think it's grounded in the kind of basic features of the agent and then a question about whether or not they have responsibility relevant control, where that folds in circumstantial features, or the contextual features, and that's the way I tend to like to do it. For our purposes, I don't think any of these distinctions here are going to matter tremendously, but given a broadly ecological approach, the shape of a specifically social world is not an incidental parameter, right? So you could think, well, like, yeah, these things are incidental. You need to say something about them, but we don't have to say that much about them. So one take home from this is, I think actually, so this is the take home that I haven't yet earned, but I'm hoping to by the end of the talk, that it's not just enough to gesture that we have to worry about the opportunities, or we have to worry about situational control. We have to actually say something about the way those things are structured and what the conditions are under which we have, as it were, morally adequate opportunities, or when we have sufficient situational control. And on the face of it, I think this requires some theoretical tools that aren't typically a part of our toolkits when we're doing theorizing about Phil action or moral responsibility. For example, it bears noting that in a particular social matrix in which an agent's operating, the operative social ontology is invariably historically circumscribed. That is, the social roles, the institutions, and the social meanings, and the moral and social norms with currency in that social world vary by time and place. It's not as though there's a single stable set of what those social rules are that structure the agency. They're going to be cross-culturally true everywhere and every when for how it is that it's, or for what it is for us to reasonably demand of agents such that they would be culpable for failing to respond to those considerations or not. Okay, so one might think the ecology of agency is typically going to be a historically specific one. A given arrangement of the social world will require and will produce a distinctive array of learned techniques, acquired sensibilities, internalized norms, and non-reflective dispositions of perception and action. And we might say, therefore, that ecological agency is typically encultured agency. So that now we've got to the punchline here, why I started with encultured agency. I think it's going to turn out that ecological agency has to be encultured agency in the typical case, and the different configurations the world will enable, incentivize, and disincentivize different kinds of agency. And these in turn are going to have consequences for what we can reasonably expect of agents who are thus enculturated. So on a fully elaborated ecological account of responsible agency, we're going to say something both about the operative social, about the agent and the operative social ontology. Okay, so that's claim one, as it were, of the talk. Water break. All right. Okay, so here's claim two. One of the best models we have for encultured agency is to be found in the work of a collection of mid-20th century philosophers in Mexico, who were concerned to produce a philosophy of, as they called it, lo mexicano, or a philosophy of Mexicanness, or that which is Mexican. So theirs was a collective effort to provide what we might today call a regional social ontology. That is a social ontology of what it was like to be Mexican in the mid-20th century. And the explanatory categories of these figures were not identical to the ones that figure in contemporary philosophy of action in the Anglophone world. But I think their project was centrally concerned to illuminate encultured agency. They were interested in trying to identify the limitations, the conditions, and the possibilities of, and to put it in kind of contemporary Anglophone Phil action-y terms, Mexican agency in the mid-20th century. What were the things that made that go forward, and what were the things that were impediments to it, and what could you say about it at a relatively general level, but that was still tied into the socio-historical moment of that place? And so I think it's a really interesting model for thinking about what it would look like to try to fill out the story about encultured agency. Okay, so I think that the successes and failures of their project are instructive in the present context, where that project or something like it looks like it's maybe going live again in philosophy land. Now, so these philosophers who were interested in lo mexicano, they undertook a collective project of describing that regional ontology of Mexicanness. So it wasn't an individual thing. It was like there was a group of them that they thought, like, this is what we're going to do, is we're going to try to chart, chart the cultural milieu of Mexicanness and what the challenges are in it. And they were particularly interested in providing an account of the primary categories within which the Mexican social world was constructed, and they understood this in broadly phenomenological terms. So this group, they call themselves the Hyperion group. They were interested. Ontology and phenomenology weren't separate endeavors for them. An adequate phenomenology of the experience of what it was like to be Mexican and to act under Mexican cultural circumstances was in part for them an ontology of the social world and the lived experiences it produced. There were a number of related accounts in this way. So some of you who are just learned people, as philosophy professors undoubtedly are, and who've done your reading of all the Nobel Prize winners in literature, have undoubtedly read Octavio Paz's Labyrinth of Solitude. This was very much in that vein and part of that same project of kind of trying to chart the cultural dimensions of a national, regional, historical moment. So that was the thing that was maybe the most famous thing to come out of that project. But amongst specifically the philosophers, the work of this particular figure, Emilio Uranga, his analysis was the one that kind of defined the operative concepts for this group of people and provided a kind of attractor position around which the other Mexican existentialists who were working in this project oriented their account. And the main reason for talking about Mexican existentialism is not just because it's I think philosophically interesting, but it's also so that I can tell you about the neologism of mexistentialism, which is oftentimes the entire point of giving a talk like this, is so that you can introduce people to fun new words to say. Okay, so for Uranga, Mexican being was, as he characterized it, accidental. Accidentality is a mode of being characterized by an orientation to another kind of being, namely a substance. So he's borrowing some medieval vocabulary, where the accident is characterized by a lack of contingency or dependence, by a lack or by contingency or by dependence. So think accidents are people who don't enjoy a broad framework of norms and meanings and values that they can take for granted in deliberating about what to do or how to live their lives. Okay, so again, we're working out of a broadly existentialist tradition here, but the idea is, so Uranga introduces this distinction between accidents and substances, where accidents are people who can't take for granted some relatively stable framework of norms, meanings, and values, and substances are people who can do that. So Uranga thought that part of the distinctive position of mid-20th century Mexicans is that they were accidents, in contrast to lots of other groups of people that were substances, where again, what this means is that these groups of people had a relatively stable framework of norms, meanings, and values that afforded them ways of thinking about and deliberating about what their actional options were at a given time and place. So the result is that the Urangan accident, but not the Urangan substance, is in a state that he called zozobra, which Uranga characterized as restlessness, or the state of not knowing what one can depend on. And so the idea for Uranga is that people who are in this state of accidentality, they tend to be accompanied by a characteristic set of psychological syndromes. So unwillingness to act or commit to things, a rigoristic concern for preserving their, as it were, their personal dignity, introversion, and maybe melancholy. So he thinks that people who are in this position of accidentality have a kind of distinctive psychological profile. I saw that Dave Shoemaker sat up when I said distinctive psychological profile. Okay, so small footnote here about this. There's an intentional pun at work here in the context of post-revolutionary Mexico. So this is a country that had a national ideology around, according to which the Mexican people were mestizo, that is a mixed race people. Mestizos were on the kind of national narrative, an accidental creation of the conquest of the Americas. That is an actual accidental creation of European colonization and the indigenous, with the indigenous populations. And so the idea is that their emerging self-awareness as a distinctive people was supposedly an important part of what the then still recent Mexican Revolution had been about. So the Mexicans were in a very salient increasingly self-conscious about their historical accidentality. They were a group of people who came to exist as a kind of accident and then thought of themselves as accidents, both in the historically contingent sense, but also in the sense of a lack of confidence about what norms, meanings, and values one could count on in operating in social space. Now, the twist for Uranga is that he thinks there's something important and maybe authentic, or at least fundamentally truthful about accidentality. He thinks it's the basic human condition. Substances live in a kind of blissful delusion about about, as it were, the contingency of norms, meanings, and values in a variety of different ways. So that's the kind of the basic story that Uranga is working with. And elsewhere, I've tried to recount the story about how to think about what's going on with Uranga in a heck of a lot more detail, with an eye towards its relationship to things like double consciousness and cultural peripherality. But what I want to do here is I want to now focus on the work of two particular figures who were operating in this context, but we're interested in understanding a particular kind of thing that they call the echo. And so the first is this figure, Jorge Portilla, and he was in particular interested in the social mechanisms of enculturation in Mexico and in other countries. He wrote a little bit about Germany and the United States. And then a second figure of interest is this philosopher, Rosario Castellanos, who was sort of, as it were, adjacent to the Hyperion group in a number of different ways. And I think her project is especially interesting in a variety of different ways, but we'll talk more about that in just a moment. So, okay, so we're going to talk about Portilla and then Castellanos. So Portilla, in a collection of essays, decides that he wants to tell a story about the distinctive cultural configurations in Mexico, aspiring to describe some of the distinctive ways in which agency unfolds within them. And so he's working out of that tradition of the Hyperion group. And he shares this presumption that the relevant unit of cultural analysis is the nation. And I think that this is a thing to flag here, is you might wonder whether or not nations are always the right unit of cultural analysis for telling your story about social ontologies. Maybe social ontologies are going to, the kind of containers for them might look different than just being nation states, but he takes for granted that it's nation states. And so his thought goes something like this. Mexican being is characterized by what he calls a collection of horizons, which he understands as sets of social meanings that are often tacit and unreflectively held. Okay, so horizons are collections of social meanings that are tacit and unreflectively held. Social arrangements support or undermine which horizons are enjoyed by people in a given area. So in the case of Mexico, the available horizons tend to produce beings that are accidental in the Urangan sense. Right? So he thinks the social environment produces a kind of accidentality in that Urangan sense. Now, here's how he explains the significance of horizons. He thinks these horizons, that is, these tacit and unreflectively held views about social meanings, are critically important for human action. One of the primary functions is to serve as a wall against which the meaning of our actions bounces back like an echo. In this way, the echo of the act, for example, of voting, may arrive with a certain distortion that indicates to us that in our national political horizon, there exists certain mysterious peculiarities. The echo that bounces off of our national community perhaps makes it evident that our vote did not have the exact meaning that we were giving it. His thought here is that these horizons, these shared social meanings, including the meanings of actions and social roles, enable us to make sense of our actions. Efforts to vote, to commit a crime, to get married, and so on. These things have an intended significance. They have an intended significance or meaning for the agent who intends and acts. The echoes confirms the social meaning of the act. So here's one way to think about these kinds of cases. So I think this is one of the things that's really interesting about the Portilla case, is he says, look, there are these cases where the performance of an act in a social milieu doesn't generate an echo that has the meaning that it looks like the social act is, as it were, structured to produce. So here's some of the cases that he gives. So he gives three different cases that I think each are really interesting in different kinds of ways. So one is the bribery case. So here the thought goes something like this. If you're living in a social milieu under which bribery is widespread and common, the significance of laws, criminal laws, begins to look really unstable. That is it a crime when you do X or Y? Well, who knows? It depends on whether or not there's a cop there. It depends on whether or not the cop's willing to take the bribe. And so this alters the social significance about what actions you can do. And if you think one of the things that having a criminal law is supposed to do and having legal enforcement is supposed to do is to stabilize which actions we think are forbidden, which actions are not to be pursued, which actions are off the table. When you have a collapse of enforcement of these things, or you can buy off the enforcement of these things by bribery, it destabilizes the social meaning of that whole set of actions that was supposed to have been, as it were, cordoned off as unacceptable and to be punished or to be disincentivized in a way. It opens up the possibility of engaging in those acts. So Portilla thinks that the kind of collapse of the rule of law is a case where the social significance of your act now collapses. So there's an echo failure. There's a failure of the kind of the significance of the act that you're committing to get to echo back to you. So if you think about the Magdalena and Jorge case, did they act illegally? Well, they were in the bike lane, but does that mean that they couldn't be in the bike lane? Well, in a world in which you can readily buy off cops if they're unhappy about it, it's not clear if there's no cyclists around is how they're thinking about the case, presumably. But then, like if the cop is able to capriciously sanction you or fine you for something without having to worry about retaliation or consequence for doing so, again, it now becomes unclear if things that were totally legal actions can look like they're illegal actions or be treated with the social significance where they're illegal. He has two other cases that I'll mention very briefly here in passing about cases where there's echo failure. So one is a kind of market failure. So these are cases where there's no stable price on things. So Portilla thinks in cultures where you haggle about everything and haggle about the price of things, that the kind of meaning of economic opportunity is constantly up for grabs. Where there are no stable prices and there's no predictable prices, and what the things cost is constantly subject to negotiation, and your ability to exert personal influence or to leverage friends and connections and so on, destabilizes the economic value of things. So we have a kind of the criminal value, the economic value case. The third case he gives is a kind of domestic social relations kind of case. So in a number of countries in Latin America, but certainly in Mexico at the time at which he was writing in the 1940s and 50s, it was not uncommon for men to have second or sometimes even third families apart from the family that they married. And so they had a term for this, la casa chica, which literally means the small house. So la casa grande, the big house, that was the official publicly recognized relationship. And then there would be these other sometimes secondary or tertiary families. And part of Portilla's reflections on this phenomenon is that, well, it's really unclear what a commitment to monogamy means and what marriage means if it's par for the course, as it were, that people have other families and other marriages that are not maybe recognized in the same way. But what does a marriage vow mean in a context where the kind of public commitment is regularly violated, and people don't really expect that everybody's going to adhere to the public commitment. So he has these three different cases, right? The criminal case, the economic case, and then the kind of the social arrangement case. And he thinks, okay, we've got echo failures across these cases. And he thinks this is a case then where social institutions have failed to do their job of stabilizing the meaning of certain kinds of acts. So legal institutions have failed, the institution of marriage has failed, and economic institutions have failed to stabilize the meaning of acts, which then makes it uncertain what it is that you're doing when you act in those domains. And it's every time it's an experiment, as it were, to find out what the meaning of the act is that you're going to commit to. All right, so that's Portilla. Here's the second figure I want to say a little bit about, and this is Rosario Castellanos. She was a philosopher who was interested in a lot of these same kinds of issues, and her master's thesis was this book that was later published as a book called On Feminine Culture. And it's about gender norms and their effect on artistic and especially literary production. And Castellanos was a super interesting figure. I mean, she's one of these, in Mexico, philosophers are oftentimes less kind of traditional academics. And it's much more common that you have people who are kind of polymaths in various ways. So, maybe they go and they do some philosophy, they do some fiction writing, they do some essays, maybe they're involved in politics. So you get these kind of, as it were, less specialized figures in various ways. And so Castellanos went on to become a very important figure in the feminist movement in Mexico. and also was a very prominent and successful fiction writer and poet. And eventually she was the Mexico's ambassador to Israel, and she died when she was in Israel from an accident. But so she's kind of a super interesting figure, and at the time kind of widely regarded as one of the kind of luminary figures. And her training was initially in philosophy, and she wrote this book on feminine culture that was kind of reflections about the way in which gender norms have effects on artistic production. There are a lot of, for anybody who's read The Second Sex, a lot of amazing and striking parallels to The Second Sex in her writing. And what's even weirder is that it turned out when she was finishing writing up on feminine culture, Beauvoir was actually in Mexico, like blocks away from where Castellanos was, but they apparently never interacted. So they met for the first time a couple of years later when she was visiting in France. But it's one of these kind of things where there's these startling parallels in a bunch of the work. So here's the thought in Castellanos. So Castellanos is curious about this question about why is so much kind of prominent cultural production done by men, and why is so little of it done by women? And she gives the following kind of explanation. She says, well, part of it is, of course, if you have a world that is structured by gender norms, where women are primarily responsible for caretaking, it's not going to be super surprising that they're not going to be engaged in a lot of artistic and literary endeavors. And that when they do get engaged in artistic, literary, and scientific kinds of endeavors, that it's oftentimes going to be in fields where there's relatively low barriers to entry. And so what you should expect is that women will have historically, when they had opportunities to do these things, what they tended to do was to go into things like literature, where you need a room and some paper and you're off to the races, but where you don't necessarily have to have a big expensive lab, you don't have to have lots of expensive tools to produce it. Art is more demanding because, of course, then you need to have money to buy the oil, and you need years of training and so on, but people can sit down and write. And so she has this kind of story about why cultural production has gone one way rather than another. Now, I think, people can raise criticisms about a variety of the ways in which she sets this up. And one thing you might think is that women's cultural production has been more robust than she herself acknowledges, and that it has been overlooked when it has existed. But she starts from the basic presumption that there's less of it and it's less frequently outstanding. And so granting her a presumption that I think can reasonably contest in a variety of different ways, one of the interesting things that results from this is a very particular diagnosis about what she thinks is going on and why it is that that great art, to put it crudely, we might say, why is so much great art so doodly? And the reason why it's so doodly, she thinks, is because it's it's partly about the way in which social norms have structured what it is that women do. So she thinks, even though there are all of these economic pressures that I was talking about the differential access to being able to produce it, when you look at the work itself, what is it about? She thinks, well, disproportionately, it's about when you look at women's literature, what is it about? It's memoirs about their life. It focuses on the domestic activities, and it's a lot of introspective sort of element. And in contrast, when we look to like the really great works of art, she thinks that oftentimes they are about expanding the sense of self to give people a sense about nature or other lives or events or themes that are much larger than the author, him or herself. And she thinks that the shortcoming of a lot of women's literature and art up to her period of time had been that it was disproportionately, as it were, narcissistic. It was focused on the author and very rarely about anything else. And so she thinks this is a phenomenon that cries out for explanation. Like, why is this going on? So here's her diagnosis. She thinks it goes something like this. And in lots of parts of the world, and certainly in Mexico, there was a kind of expectation that women were involved in caretaking. The caretaking demands tended to be so robust as to be mutually exclusive with artistic life. So when women rebelled against the demands and decided to go and pursue artistic lives, that one of the consequences was that they were worried that they were going to give up their visibility in the social sphere because they weren't going to perform femininity in the right way. So what happened is, because they had rebelled against the traditional performance of femininity, she thinks there was disproportionate pressure to perform or reinscribe the femininity in the art. And so this is why the art ends up being about domestic life and about the performance of the emotional interior life of the woman writer. And so she thinks this is why it's basically about, about domestic life in various ways, is it's a way to try to avoid or block or preclude the complete invisibility of the artist by performing or reperforming femininity in a certain kind of way. And so partly what the way in which the notion of the echo occurs for Castellanos is that the idea of the echo for Castellanos emerges in this context as what you want to see is you want to see an echo of yourself in your work, because you no longer have the ready social recognition that comes from performing the normative gender role for you out in public. And so now you want to reaffirm yourself. How do you do it? You project yourself into the work. This makes the work narcissistic, but then the version of yourself that you're projecting into the work is going to be structured by the external social norms. So for those of you who've read your Beauvoir, this is all going to look recognizable and familiar. But I think for our purposes, one of the interesting things is that you might think, here's what Castellanos is picking up about the nature of the social echo. That is the response that one is looking for from the social sphere, is where Portilla thinks, well, look, a good set up social world is going to reliably provide you an echo without distortion. So that's part of what social institutions are supposed to do, is to create stable norms, meanings, and values that the stability of that meaning can allow you to make choices about your life where you can reasonably anticipate what your choices are going to mean. But where institutions fail to do that, now your choice set begins to look really chaotic and unpredictable. And then what Castellanos notes is, well, sure, but don't think that those echoes and meanings, that somehow just because you have reliable echoes coming back to you, that those echoes can't themselves be subverted to oppressive kinds of structures. So yes, social norms are really important for stabilizing social meaning, and we need that to enable certain kinds of agency, but they aren't always innocent. And in the case of life under patriarchy, Castellanos thinks that what happens is that women are smuggling these things in, and as it were, performing the oppressive gender norms in what was supposed to have been a liberatory moment of going into art. So there's a way in which the thought that you can perform and reliably produce an echo of what the social norm is turns out to be a trap if the social norms themselves are not set up in the right way. Okay, so the short version is patriarchy is nefarious. When women break out of those rules to pursue art, they seek validation of their agency, want to be recognized as agents, especially because they're living counter-normative lives. But unless they perform the normative conception of their gender in their art, they run the risk that their art's going to be ignored, because patriarchy. So the woman artist seeks to give herself an echo in her art to affirm herself in her individuality, but it's always performing the version of the self that is already been given to you by the cultural milieu you're in. So her recommendation is women artists have to get past normative gender. And then here's the quote: with such force that it may be able to overcome those immediate and fragile peripheries and allow her to dive into those depths where she might reach her true and until now inviolable roots, pushing aside those conventional images of femininity that men have prepared for her. And thus she may form her own image, an image based on her personal irreplaceable experience, an image that may not coincide with that other image. So part of the thought here is this is a story for Castellanos about, and this actually kind of structures a lot of her subsequent work, is the thought is, what does femininity look like that isn't already structured by patriarchy? What does that look like? And her answer is, we don't even know. We don't even know because we've never tried it. We haven't had an opportunity to pursue that. So I think that these two ideas here that I want to hook on to here. So one is just the idea that the Portilla idea that institutions are important for stabilizing the social meanings of actions, and that's important for enabling agency to be predictable, to be able to understand what the consequences of what it is that you're going to do are going to be like. And then what Castellanos rightly gets is the thought that, yeah, but those ways of arranging things are always normatively laden in ways that we should have reason to interrogate or ask questions about, or to be cautious about which ways we're stabilizing those norms, meanings, and values. So rule of law is great, standardized institutions are great, but they better be set up in the right way. Now, last thought about this. So the thing I think is really interesting about the Castellanos thought in the context in which she's writing, and where she's thinking and talking to the Mexican existentialists, that part of what's interesting about this is that the philosophy of the Mexican, filosofía de lo mexicano, I think there's a way in which the right way to understand what Castellanos is up to is it's really a critique about, and this is a gendered language point, lo mexicano, this, so to refer to that which is Mexican, where it's gendered in Spanish as mexicano, so the quote neutral gender is male gender. And so there's a way in which I think part of the Castellanos critique amounts to a version of the, wait a minute, you claim to be giving a story about lo mexicano, but you've said nothing about la mexicana. You've said nothing about the experience of women under the social regime. And so it's going to turn out that if you want to do social ontology of encultured agents, it's going to turn out that we have to be very cautious on the Castellanos version of this. We have to be very cautious about who it is that we're talking about and the kind of complexities in which the way in which the social world is going to be structuring the kinds of agencies that are available to different people. And so you might think, yeah, great job, guys. You did a good job of characterizing what life is like for some people under, what Mexicanidad looks like for Mexicanos, but you neglected this entire, you neglected 50% of the Mexicans running around about what their social ontology looks like and what kinds of options are available to them. And so I think that's part of the critique that Castellanos is offering, part of what makes her interesting in that context. Okay, so a couple of quick concluding thoughts. So first of all, I think those of us who are inclined to broadly ecological theories of agency should think more about institutions, about social meanings, and the conditions for reliable echoes of the social meanings of our acts. And I think this is a natural place for some of us to go in our thinking about the nature of agency. Second thought is cases like the Magdalena Jorge cases, these kind of more encultured cases that are super messy sorts of cases, I think are really interesting cases, but they have connections to some live issues that are right now sort of at the periphery of Mexican philosophy and Phil action, and in particular with what is sometimes called the narco problem. So there's this interesting disagreement about how to think about what's going on in the case of narcos, of the cartels in Mexico. So there's some people who have the view that that members of these cartels are paradigmatically cases of people who are responsible for the wrongdoings that they do. And they're like, if those folks aren't responsible, then who the hell is responsible for the terrible things they do? Greg's like, well, actually no one. And then there are other folks who think, no, the nature of the social world that produces the narco, the nature of the world that pulls people into cartel life is so totalizing in the way in which it collapses available options for people and in the way in which it incentivizes cooperation and engagement with cartels and cartel life, that it's exculpating. And so there's this interesting debate about whether or not the narco is paradigmatically responsible or paradigmatically non-responsible. And partly, I think it turns on exactly these kinds of phenomena. That is, to the extent to which it's responsible or not, it looks like it's partly a function about what the social environment provides by way of opportunities and what we can reasonably demand of people under considerably suboptimal option sets. So that's why we philosophers of action ought to be thinking about Mexican existentialism. So there you go.
Manuel, thank you very much. Okay, so before I entertain other people's questions, I had a question about how you understand this specific issue, because I think what the talk is great. So this notion of encultured agency, or I don't know, there are a couple different ways you might describe it, but I wondered whether, so one is looking at it like situationally, right? So there are the situations in which we're embedded, which can influence what's appropriate. So like, as I think, my wife's Brazilian. So the corruption piece is like something that we've talked about quite a bit, because there is just built right into the firmament of the society. It's accepted that that's the way it works, but then
and it's impossible to resist it.
Yeah, no, and not only
yeah, that's the worry.
So there's a term like jeito. So not only is it impossible to resist it, but like smart people know how to game it. It's even weirder to the extent to which you don't know how to game it. It's like there's a sort of like one-upmanship with respect to like taking advantage of the corruption. I don't mean people who are in higher positions of power. I mean even people who are not, like getting one up on the corruption is like sort of a social game they play. But like, so that's looking at it at the level of the situations that they're in. But I wonder whether you also mean, and some of the thinkers that you reference also mean that, so we also internalize norms so that dispositionally now, I have already sort of brought this stuff on board. So it's no longer just a function of the situations and the choices the situation may afford me. It's also like I've been habituated in such a way that I'm going to navigate those situations in a way that is itself encultured. So I guess I was trying to figure out whether or not the thought is like it's both of those two. So it's not just the sort of external, the decision architecture looking at like what's going on out in the world and the choices it affords me, but also the fact that like how I navigate that is itself part of the process. So it's like it's happening at both. So it's not just the enculture might make it sound like it's something that's sort of external, but it's also, these things are also simultaneously internalized. Is that right? Is that the way to?
Yeah, good. Thanks for pressing this question. So I think that's exactly right. I mean, so one of the things that I'm probably not careful enough when I talk about this is this shows up in a couple of different places. So one is the transition from kind of broadly atomistic to ecological theories of agency, I think is one place in which I want to be careful to say, well, it's not that the atomistic stuff goes away. That's still part of the story. It's still going to matter what your beliefs, desires, and intentions are, and what your dispositions are. And these things are going to be influenced by the stuff outside the head. It's that we also need to talk about the outside of the head piece. But I want to hold on to both of those pieces. So that's one place. A second place, I think, about well, it's partly it's about how environments shape your sensibilities. I think this was very much in this was very much taken as foundational for the Mexistentialists. And this is why they thought that there was a story they could tell about what it was to be Mexican, or what the Mexican phenomenology was not just that there was a kind of social milieu out there, but that the social milieu shaped the kinds of dispositions that people had. And this is why there was a distinctive psychological profile, they thought, that was more common, maybe not universal, but certainly more common for people living under those conditions. The third thought is, I actually think the distinction you're raising, it maps on to what I take the contributions of Portilla and Castellanos respectively to be. So Portilla is talking about the external construction of the social world and the institutions and the way in which we respond to the institutions. And Castellanos is talking about what happens when we internalize some of those kinds of things and the way in which they're going to shape how we navigate the space of external possible opportunities or possibilities that are made available to us. And then I think both of those pieces matter. Now, of course, one worry you could think is by the time we're done accounting for all of these things, maybe it's never reasonable for us to make normative demands on people or something like that. So there's that kind of worry out there that nothing I've said directly addresses. But I think in terms of like where this account has to go, I think it needs both of those pieces.
Yeah, good. I wanted to make sure I was thinking about it clearly, which often I'm not. All right, sorry, enough from me. So John, you're up.
Great, thank you, Manuel. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That was really interesting. There was a lot there. So I thought I had a pretty well-formed question, but now maybe I don't think so. But one thing, quickly, what you said about the narcos, I think something similar might be going on with the Russian soldiers, some of the young Russian conscripts there. Sometimes when I read what they've done, I think, wow, horrible, horrible paradigmatic case of evil moral response. But then, you know, other times I say, well, maybe Putin and the generals, but those kids, not so much. So anyway, that might be just a quick observation, but could I put it, so much going on in your paper, but one way I read it is traditionally, it wasn't just that action theory or agency theory, broadly construed, was atomistic, but it was at least purported to be normatively neutral. You know, like you might give an account of responsibility in terms of a certain kind of, well, you wanted your theory of responsibility to be neutral with respect to moral theories, you know, like some kind of deontology or consequentialism and so forth. You could plug in your account of responsibility and, you know, it would be consistent, it would work for these different theories. So we wanted our views to be neutral. And also, in some ways, it was normatively neutral, but also not, we weren't going to discuss the ways in which our psychologies work, perhaps in interaction with our environment, let's say to help to specify what we take to be our options and so forth. We wanted to, it's not our job. So the way I understand you is to kind of challenge that orientation, challenge the idea that we should be normatively neutral and substantively minimal in agency theory. So you want to take us on that different track. I don't know if you want to, if you have observations about that, but I still kind of think, you know, at least conceptually, there are two sets of issues. And one is an issue about what agency is and what intention is and intentional action and moral responsibility. Then there are another set of issues which are normative. And as an example, you talk about exculpation, certain, if someone is subject to pressure, which we couldn't reasonably expect the individual to resist, where that's of course conditioned by our cultural milieu and expectation, then the individual is exculpated. That's a normative. To me, exculpation is not non-blameworthiness, but moral responsibility is, in my view, a different notion, although that's contested. But okay, I'll stop. My basic point is either you're creating this big muddle where you're confusing and conflating, or, and I prefer to think of it this way, you are identifying a problem with thinking atomistically and normatively neutrally, and you're invoking the Mexican existentialist tradition to kind of encourage us to go into a less atomistic and neutral way. Okay, that's my comment.
Yeah, thanks. This was a super helpful reflection, and I think that maybe I can say a little bit to clarify what was undoubtedly a muddle. So I think so one of the things I guess I would be inclined to say is it might well be the case that bare agency or agency as such, where maybe we think, you know, this is kind of roughly goal-directed behavior, or, and this is where I say, Al, quick, tell me what agency as such is. And then, and so it might be that those kinds of things we can get along pretty well with the atomistic story that is normatively neutral and that doesn't have cultural entanglement. So I think it's not that there isn't a project there. I think that there is a project there, and I think it's actually been a very successful project. In fact, in some sense, I think, you know, I don't think I said this in this talk, but I actually think in some sense it's the paradigmatically successful research program in 20th century Anglophone philosophy. You know, the kind of payoffs that grew out of that program has spread across a whole bunch of different fields in lots of really rich and interesting ways in which people who are outside of philosophy of action oftentimes don't realize that these ideas have gotten taken up in a lot of different adjacent fields. And so I think So put that way, I think there absolutely was a really interesting project there. It was a very fruitful project. It did a lot of really valuable work. But I also think we're really interested in forms of agency that aren't just bare agency. And I think we're interested in things like morally responsible agency or autonomous agency or competent navigators of social space forms of agency. And those kinds of agencies, we don't get to be disentangled from social ontologies. And so there, I think if we want to talk about those things, and I think moral responsibility is actually one of these places where that interaction goes live, I think it is incumbent upon us to say more about the ways in which those connections arise. And that's not to say that there aren't, as it were, abstract elements, or that we can't say a lot of really useful and generalizable things about responsibility, culpability, and so on. Because I think, of course, we have and we can. But a complete and satisfactory account is going to need to say something about some of these. And one way to put it is, it becomes part of our job if we want to have a full account of these things. And I think there are reasons to want to have a full account. And it starts to emerge when we think about things like the coercion cases, or when we think about things like the narco cases or whatever. I don't think we get to tell a story very easily about these things without some of the enculturation element. And so then the question is how to go about doing that. And then I think that's where looking to models of places that have tried to pursue that project relatively systematically begins to look interesting.
Thank you. That was helpful.
Good. Okay, Samantha.
Hi. So I thought it was a great talk, and I kind of was wondering during the talk. So you talk a lot about like what is reasonable to expect of agents given certain sort of social circumstances that in many ways are influenced by social and political institutions. And in this sort of ecological approach to agency, I have to ask, is there an impetus to maybe shift some of the focus on individual responsibility and shift that towards like what it would look like to hold political and social institutions responsible? And another thing, like a sort of follow-up, if that makes sense, if it makes sense to shift some of that focus, how do we do it? And do we hold social and political institutions responsible in the same way that we hold individuals? Because I think, I mean, if you follow like the sort of Straussonian thought that responsibility follows as a result of our interpersonal like relationships, it doesn't seem necessarily like social and political institutions maybe have that same sort of relationship to us. So I guess the questions boil down to like, does it make sense to maybe have some focus on what it means to hold social and political institutions culpable, responsible, morally responsible? And if so, how do you do that?
Yeah, so these are great questions for which I have only poor answers for. So let's see. As a first pass, I think my interest here is in what to say mainly about individual moral responsibility. But I think that's compatible with the observation that you're making that seems to me right, that once you start thinking in these ways, it's very natural to start worrying about the kind of culpability and responsibility holding of much larger than individual agents. And there's even in some cases, even for folks like myself who are primarily interested in the individual responsibility case, there's a special pressure because I am committed to the thought that, and this is something I'm not going to be able to defend here at all really in any satisfying way, but I'll just assert it boldly, that whether or not people are culpable and responsible and are responsible agents is partly a function of the context and environments that they're in. And so then it becomes incumbent on us to create environments that are responsibilizing environments, that produce, create, scaffold, sustain, and enhance our ability to be the kinds of agents that can be rightly held to account. And so there's a way in which, on the way I tend to think about these things, there really is a live, as it were, social political question. There are these social political questions about how do we create individually responsible people, and what are our duties and obligations to create individually responsible people. But once you start thinking that, I think you're right to think, well, okay, yeah, but now like it's not just people, right? We've got these other kinds of questions that go live for collectives and institutions and the design of those things, and what do we do when they violate various kinds of norms, and is our relationship to those things the same and well modeled on the individual case? Elsewhere, I've done very little thinking about this, but not enough to be confident about the answers. But I'm somewhat skeptical that the answers from the individual case generalized to institutions, because I think that the features of institutions and collectives, they're just different kinds of pressures on how they operate, and they're for starters, they don't have psychologies. Or they don't have psychologies like we do, and they don't respond in the same way to the kinds of the pressures that we respond to in the individual case. So even if you thought they too are going to be ecologically bounded, as it were, and subject to ecological pressures, it doesn't mean those pressures are going to operate in the same way in which they do with creatures that have, relatively predictable general psychologies in the ways in which we do. Though there might be, again, local enculturation practices that transform even at the level of businesses and institutions and collectives. So, but that's all, for my purposes, undeveloped frontier.
All right, more on that moving forward from Manuel. That's
Or
good.
Samantha, maybe Samantha will.
Or Samantha, yeah, both, in conjunction even, together. So Miguel, yes, you're up.
Yeah, first of all, thank you to Manuel for the talk. It was great, especially for me as a Mexican. And well, my question is a bit broad, but it is about the relation between encultured agency and the meaning of life, especially thinking in the case of the narcos. A few years ago, there was a piece where they talked about that kids between the ages of 13 and 17 thought that they would select as a career to be a narco because they preferred living a few years well or with money and dying young against living 80 years or having a long life. So I was wondering what were your thoughts on the relation between encultured agency and the meaning of life, thinking about these sorts of cases.
Yeah, this is, so I don't know this work, but this is seems to me a really interesting deployment of the quality adjusted life years model that gets sometimes used in bioethics contexts. So I mean, so interesting questions here. So I don't know what to say about the meaning of life component. I don't have a view about how to think about the meaning of life, but here's the piece that I think I can say that is maybe kind of trying to grope its way towards the beginnings of a sketch of one way in which somebody might want to think about these things. So, because something like this. One of the things that thinking about encultured agency makes very salient is the way in which communities or societies or groups, I mean, you can make the cuts in different places and use different names for different ways of arranging those things. It's the dispositions thought that Thomas was gesturing at before can train us up to be better and worse adapted for certain kinds of life. And these things can in some sense be really they like depending on how many alternatives you make available for people or not, or how coercive they are, they can be experienced in wildly different ways, right? So sometimes people will experience some of these things as a very traditional culture might be experienced by some people as massively oppressive and restrictive, and for other people as enormously security producing. And so there are going to be questions at the level of generality of communities, and then there are going to be questions at the level of individuals. And so from the standpoint of, as it were, broadly systems design or community design or something like that, it might well turn out that part of the answer to the kind of question you're asking is, well, it might be that and here this is now we're sort of in the domain of some amount of sociology, but I'll just conjecture that it could turn out that sort of open-ended, cosmopolitan, we're trying to be silent on comprehensive doctrines, let the market provide everything that people could want, could do really badly for people feeling like, you've secured meaningful lives, and it does really badly for for certain kinds of meaningfulness estimates, whereas maybe certain kinds of traditional cultures do better on that metric. But those are going to be one value, one value metric amongst multiple about why we would set things up one way rather than another, or plump for one rather than another. And there's presumably lots of options in between super traditional society and super open-ended, let capitalism and cosmopolitanism eat it all models. And so that's, I think, the beginnings of where this kind of approach would say, look, there are going to be these kind of complicated interaction effects, and whether we're asking about individuals or we're asking about, as it were, disposing large groups of people to find more and less satisfying answers for questions about meaning in life or meaning of life, then those equations will get messy very fast.
Okay, so Dave, you're up.
Hey, my friend. Everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So as you well know, I'm a simple man. And so talk me off of the following view. So it's an individualistic, atomistic view. It's a quality of will view about the nature of responsible agency. That to be a responsible agency is a function of your quality of will, and that's inside the head. It's a function of intentions and motivations and so forth. This is perfectly compatible with a vast contextualist story about the nature of quality of will, depending on cultural stories that you tell about certain things like regard and respect and what counts as such in any particular society. And so, but the ultimate target is quality will in every case. It's just that what counts as such is going to vary from culture to culture. And then apply that to the messy story that you tell at the beginning, where it turns out the messiness is just a matter of there being a whole bunch of different things that are possibly the target of appraisal. A whole bunch of things happened in that story. There is a certain kind of thing that happened when they're driving on the bike lane, and then there's the thing when the cop pulls them over, and there's the way in which they talk to the cop, and all of these things can be assessed in terms of quality will of the participants. So yeah, you're right. It's an incredibly messy story if we're thinking of the whole agglomeration of events. But in terms of every individual instance, you can tell a quality will story. It's an inside the head story, but it's contextually informed. And so talk me off of that atomistic ledge.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know that I'm, so I know that I won't talk you off the atomistic ledge. But here's a thought. So I was, as you were talking, I was trying to come up with a snappy analogy, and I'm too old, slow, and tired to have come up with it quickly. But I guess I think, well, what you're calling quality of will and insisting is the elegant, simple sort of thing, just is a fancy way of redescribing what the problem is. And all that contextual stuff that you say, oh yeah, it's going to be as richly contextual as you want. I say, yes, tell me about that. How does that work? What are the things that drive that bit? What are the things that alter whether or not somebody's got good or bad quality will? And going accounts of this, I think, tend to get very hand-wavy very fast about what are those features of the context and the environment and the opportunities and so on. So I think, that it might be true that there are, and I mean, so let me step back here for just a moment. I mean, I think one of the things that is going on in theories of moral responsibility is that we have a lot of different ways of regimenting phenomena, where these different ways of regimenting things, our preferred theories, are going to have the bells and whistles to be able to say something about those things, but we're going to put those things in different places. And so I think that one way of putting it is the kind of ecological element that gets brought out when folks at UCSD want to talk about opportunities or context dependent control, or these kinds of ecological elements are going to get pushed into stories about, oh, sure, there's some context in the that speaks to the question of quality will, but it's the quality will that matters. And these are going to be different ways of locating where the phenomena is that's going to need explaining. But I think in both of these cases, we still need to have that story. And so I think, so I mean, I don't have a lot more to say about it, because I don't think there's going to be a single elegant case I can give where it just turns out the quality of will theorist says, no, I need to stop speaking in quality of will ways and now start speaking in ecological agency ways, because you're going to move the pieces around and just say, no, I put that stuff over here. I mean, and of course, there are things that folks can and have said about this, but I also take it that they're, about why, what's wrong with quality of will views. I think I can think of a paper that some guys have written that like complains about quality of will views. And but anyway, you might think, there are going to be these cases, but then of course, as is the nature of the art, there are things that one can say in response to these kinds of things. And so it's at the end of the day, what we're left with are given these different ways of thinking and talking and arranging where the theory goes to account for the phenomena, which turns out to be which ways of talking and arranging the theory is more perspicuous at handling the cases. And those are big, hard, complicated questions. But I don't think I can talk you off with a neat, elegant sniper strike.
Sometimes you have to push people off ledges, Manuel, but that's a contextual thing.
That's right. Yeah. Depends on the size of the ledge, what's down below, how high up you are. Yeah.
All that. That's funny. So Greg, you're up.
Hi, Manuel. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great talk. It's got my brain firing on all cylinders right now. I'll stay away from what I might think is the obvious comment. I mean, I think there's a lot of similarity between this encultured approach and what skeptics have thought long about in terms of agency being embedded in various repressive systems, poverty, sexism, and I think there's a lot of interesting things. On a compatibilist approach, though, so I'll take my skeptic hat off here for a minute. And this goes to maybe Thomas's question and some of the other earlier questions. There seems like there might be a couple things going on here that we might want to separate. So here's how I was thinking about it. So we could say, maybe consistent with an atomistic approach, free will remains kind of the control condition for moral responsibility. And then we spell out the control required in, say, just roughly compatibilist terms, whether those be quality of will, John's reasons responsiveness, and all of that sort of remains in place. And then what's external are these sort of normative and cultured features. And so what I was thinking is that there might be two different things going on, and you might actually be talking about both, and I think of both are interesting phenomena. One might be a kind of encultured excuse approach, right? Where things like you're in a society where bribery is common, and we might talk about how enculturation could actually excuse blameworthiness in certain contexts because of the conditions that don't allow for the normative rule following that you might have in more stable societies, or where norms are more codified or enforced consistently. And then there's a separate concern, and that might be encultured constraints on agency, where the encultured constraints on agency might actually affect the atomistic approaches. For example, how poverty might affect reasons responsiveness, or how sexism might affect agents' abilities to be sensitive to certain types of reasons. And so it seems to me that those are two separate phenomena, and they're both really interesting. And I think they both are issues that come out of enculturation. So the first is just the kind of enculturation excuse. You know, like if you were to actually, and you mentioned law in some of these cases, if I were to extend this to kind of legal philosophy, one quick thought would be to propose a kind of encultured excuse. That in societies like, you know, where bribery is the norm and police officers might actually expect for you to bribe them or offer them money, it'd be kind of wrong to hold that person blameworthy for proposing a bribe to a police officer. And that should be like a possible legal defense, in part due to the instability of the normative constraints and structures. But that would be a different type of excuse than what I'm calling encultured constraints on agency, where you would have a diminished capacity or a insensitivity to certain reasons because of the enculturation. So I was wondering, what do you think of those two separate phenomena? Are you running those together? Do you think they should be separated? Do you think, you know, how does that fit into your overall program here?
Yeah, so let's see. This is interesting. I mean, so this actually is in a funny way, I think it partly related to the thing I want to say here is partly related to the thing I was saying in reply to Dave's question, that there are different ways to carve up where to go from this set of observations. And depending on which way you carve things up, you might end up with versions where these, what you're calling these two different things, end up being different facets of the same underlying phenomenon. Or you could end up going in ways where it turns out that they're different in the way in which you sketched. So here, you know, here's an example, is you might think something like, suppose you went in the kind of broadly reasons responsive way. There's a choice here about if you accept the kind of broadly ecological thought in conjunction with that. It's about, as it were, you know, what are your native the intrinsic features of the agent, and then there's the kind of opportunity of what's outside the head of what your opportunities are. Now you might think one good way to distinguish between these things is exactly the way you've done, where the thought is something like, it might be that there are features that are internal, impairments internally. So maybe the way poverty works is that poverty hijacks your attention such that you're always doing short-term thinking and can't engage in long-term thinking. So this is the kind of Jen Morton style concern about the way in which poverty impacts on agency. And then you might think, well, here's another way in which poverty interacts on your agency, is that it means that it's not reasonable to demand of parents that they feed their kids healthy organic food that costs a lot of money because poverty. And so you might think that's not an impairment on the agent side. That's an impairment in the opportunities that the world affords you. So I think that's a way in which the agency opportunity distinction within a kind of so that's the sort of way in which, like, the Nelken-Brink model wants to handle these kinds of cases. And I think the distinction drawing there maps relatively neatly onto that. A different way you can think about this is to say something like, well, what I'm interested in when I'm thinking about at least responsibility is something like, does the person have responsibility relevant control? And it's going to turn out that whether or not they have responsibility relevant control you might be able to tinker with these things in different ways that still produce the same answer. So it might be, for example, that you might have diminution of, as it were, agent side capacities, where we'd have to, of course, give an account about what that means. But suppose we could have diminution of agent side capacities in a way to measure that metric. That might be compatible with, but where what we have is really good panoply of options out in the environment. And so it might turn out that kind of agent has, and this is all super kind of toy models of this, but suppose that they have, level N amount of responsibility relevant control in that context, with that combination of things. You might think, well, we could go over to another case where we have impoverishment on the opportunities that are available, but enhanced agent side control, and that might still give you the same N, that is the same amount of responsibility relevant control. And so you might think then that, yes, we can partition those questions about what's the agent side look like and what does the environment side look like. But in some sense, these are both the whether or not we think of these things as independent or entangled might produce the same kind of answer, even if, on the sort of what I was calling the Brink-Nelkin model, these are not entangled because they're treated as independent axes that we might measure. Whereas on the model I tend to think about, these things look like they're entangled, but it looks like they're going to deliver, they might well deliver the same results in the same kinds of cases.
What do you think, if I may jump in, because I've been thinking about similar things. How do you resolve, it's like arranging the philosophical furniture, and I might like the sofa here, you might like the sofa there. Or it's like the philosophical feng shui. Ultimately, is it just a matter of taste, or how do you resolve things where they're extensionally equivalent?
Yeah, so I think I don't know that there are hard and fast universal rules here, but what I do think is that we've got that sometimes there can be good reasons to arrange them one way rather than another, because it might turn out that that although there are so it could turn out that although there are these different ways of bookkeeping or arrangements of furniture, it might turn out that some of what one way of bookkeeping or one way of arranging the furniture does is it's got commitments external to the theory of moral responsibility that turn out to be more costly or less plausible or whatever. And so that would be one way that you might try to settle these things out. Now, of course, they're going to be the typical cases. It's almost never going to be a single metric sort of thing where it's like, well, this theory, framing it that way now makes you on the hook for a certain kind of metaphysics and capacity talk, but framing it that way puts you on the hook for a certain way of thinking about causation. And this one looks costly there and not. So there might be those cases, but there might also just be genuinely cases where they come out close enough or similar enough, and then what we just need is a translation scheme where it's going to turn out that some of us say responsibility and some of us say responsabilidad. And it turns out we have a way of translating across those sounds to mean the same thing.
This is all helpful, and I see Hannah has her hand up, so I'll be really quick. Sometimes what I think can be helpful is you can figure out the picture that underlies each approach, and then you can figure out which picture you like more.
So if philosophical feng shui is not a paper title, then this is a real lost opportunity for those of you who are thinking about for those of you thinking about what to call your next paper. Anyway,
I get a footnote.
Oh yeah, that's funny. So Hannah, I think yours is the last question. So we'll do that, and then everyone that'll probably be the last question. So
thanks so much for the talk. I really liked it. I guess I'm not quite sure I understand the echo and how the echoes can relate to agency, and so my first question was going to be like, is it possible to perform an action that's entirely echoless or just an expression of your atomistic capacities? Is that like somehow like the paradigmatic expression of agency, or is it like not at all paradigmatic expression of like non-agency because it's like meaningless to other people? But then I think I had a better way of phrasing this question based on something that Samantha was asking. So thinking about like microaggressions and responsibility for microaggressions, it seems like an atomistic view is going to have a hard time explaining why people be blameworthy or responsible for microaggressions. They're rarely explicitly intended. They might not show like sort of deep disrespect and the kind of things that quality field theorists care about. But it seems like the echo of those actions and microaggressions are things that we can point to explain like why they're so bad. And maybe the fact that everyone is exercising their agency in this way is like part of the problem. And so maybe the echo in that case, or this sort of relational view, could actually see why people are more responsible or more blameworthy in a way that the atomistic view can. Or am I getting it wrong? And it's the echo view would say, no, the people are less responsible because everybody's doing it. What else do we expect of individuals? So something what you would say about those two cases, the non-echo case and then the microaggression case.
Yeah, good. So I think the right answer has to be that you can, on the can you have echoless actions, has to be that yes, you can have echoless actions. And there might be lots of contexts where echoless actions aren't particularly troubling, especially if you're not operating in a social milieu, or there's not, you know, you're off in the woods and you feel moved to perform a dance of joy. You know, whether or not they're you know, like unless you're Snow White and the birds are responding in a certain kind of way or whatever, like there's typically not going to be an echo to that action. But there are going to be a lot of cases, I think, and this is what I take the Portilla Castellanos interest to be, is that there are lots of cases where we're in socially laden environments where it turns out to be really important that the social meaning of our act is echoed back to us, that we receive some social confirmation that the thing we were intending in so acting was recognized as having that meaning. And there are different ways in which that thing can be echoed back. And there are different things that can, you know, different kinds of distortions, right, about the reliability of the echo, or what the content of the echo is, or, you know, what the implication of the echo is. And those things might be structured in lots of different ways that the reliability and the accuracy and so on might suffer distortion. But I think, but I don't think action by itself requires that you have an echo. It's just the echoes are super beneficial in social environments to confirm that your act meant what you thought it meant in so acting. On the really interesting question about responsibility for microaggressions, I haven't thought a lot about this, and so I don't have anything like a worked out view about how to think about this. But I think it's an interesting, you know, I think, you know, like, what are the cases that are troubling for atomists? I think maybe coercion cases, maybe negligence cases, microaggression cases. These all look like promising places to look. And one of the things I think is interesting about the microaggressions case is you might think in a lot of the microaggression cases, if I'm tracking this right, that in many microaggression cases, what you're having is there is a kind of bit of feedback about what the import was that was getting said, that people can, you know, in virtue of cultural incompetence, social position, incentives to ignore, not pick up on and not respond to. And so you might, so you might think that both so I mean, I you know, I think there are probably complicated things to be said about the how and why people are more and less responsible in microaggression kinds of cases. But I think the echo might be a natural place to look for part of a story about why culpability is going to hold in these cases, even when they're unintentional, if you're getting regular feedback about the, you know, that the comment was experienced as derogatory, for example, something like that. But there may be more you're thinking about here.
Okay, so any other questions or no? We all good? So thanks to Manuel, and thanks to everyone who asked good questions. I'm always amazed and thankful that everyone shows up to these things. So I'll keep doing them so long as people keep showing up. So thanks again. And if you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to email me. I will send an email reminder to most of you who are in the thing about the two talks next month by the early career research people that we've got, that I think will be important for people to come to if they can. Otherwise, I'll see you next time for the next talk. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. I really appreciate the questions. It was super helpful for me. And thank you, Thomas, for organizing all of this, and great to see everybody.
Of course. Have a good one, Manuel. Thanks.